Harry, we have seen that in many ways Peter's the main player in the first part of the book of Acts. Then somewhere with the martyrdom of Stephen, Paul comes on the scene, and by the time we get to chapter 9 becomes a major player. Now as we're looking toward the middle of the book of Acts, beginning with 11 through 13, and 13 through 15, we get more and more sense, I think, that Paul has become a major player. And one of the things I notice here, and also in Paul's own letters, is the extent to which he has companions. Especially in this case Barnabas. What do you make of that in terms of Paul's ministry or in terms of what Luke is up to when he writes the book of Acts?
Yeah, clearly by now in chapter 13, Luke is setting up Paul as a major hero of the Christian movement, and he's going to be the focal point of lots of the stories that are going to follow. But it's recognized fairly early on in Luke's narrative that Paul does not operate alone. That he's part of a missionary team, a missionary effort. And it's interesting that most of the epistles in the New Testament that we know to be written by Paul, or believed to have been written by Paul, are written by Paul and someone else.
Right.
And Paul will speak in several places in his own epistles about his collaboration with other people, sometimes with whom he stands in some tension.
Exactly.
But he certainly has close collaborators, many of them listed at the end of Romans, where he sends his greetings to lots of people. So, Paul was clearly not a solo practitioner. He was part of a team. And the team here that we meet in Acts 13 is Paul and Barnabas on the so-called first missionary journey. That probably reflects some historical reality. Paul in Galatians talks about how Barnabas separated from him at the time of the dispute in Antioch after the Apostolic Council. So for the first phase of his apostolic activity, this fellow Barnabas, priest from the diaspora, of a priestly family there from the diaspora, probably was pretty important in Paul's life. And so Luke, I think, has that detail historically correct. However much the stories of their collaboration in Acts 13 in particular, 13 and 14, might be elaborated by Luke with literary motifs.
Well, I want to come back to those literary motifs in a moment. Just a quick word on the missionary journeys. When I was but a lad in Baptist Sunday school, one of the things we had to basically learn was the map of the Mediterranean area at that time, in Journey 1, Journey 2, Journey 3. How far do you think we can count on that as being historically accurate? How far is that a kind of Lucan device? I remember from teaching Luke that we think in the gospel sometimes, it's not so much that Luke had Jesus' itinerary, but he has theological ways to shape the story to get us from Jerusalem to Jerusalem again, by way of Galilee.
Right. It's interesting that Luke focuses on Paul's journeys to the Greek-speaking world of the Eastern Mediterranean. And clearly there are things that Paul did early in his missionary activity that Luke just ignores.
Leaves out.
Paul talks about these in Galatians. So this is not a comprehensive review of all of the things that Paul did as an early Christian missionary. It is serving some sort of Lucan purpose. And part of the purpose is to move the story closer and closer to Rome, which in some ways is the goal of the whole narrative arc of Acts, beginning in Jerusalem, ending up not quite at the ends of the earth, but in Rome.
Certainly in Rome, at the center of the earth, of that world.
That's right. So we're moving in that direction. I think once we get to the so-called second missionary journey, there's a fairly close correspondence between where Paul is going and in what order to what we can reconstruct of his own journeys from his letters. So I think that by the time he's telling that part of the tale, Luke is basing himself on some sort of good historical foundation. And I suspect for this first missionary journey, Luke must have some record of Paul's travels to Cyprus and maybe the southern shore of Asia Minor. It's entirely plausible that this sort of thing could have happened. But I do think he elaborates quite a bit in this stage. And then the so-called third missionary journey that we pick up after Acts 18 is basically a trip to Jerusalem.
It is. It's the martyrdom story, really, in a way.
And there's not so much travel there as speeches, and speeches connected, as we'll see, with Paul's defense. But we know that Paul, at the end of his career, before he was shipped off to Rome, planned to go to Jerusalem.
Right.
That's what he tells us
tells us so,
in
yeah,
Romans.
in Romans, yeah.
And we know why he wanted to do that. That is something that Luke never tells us about.
Exactly. We may come back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that a little bit later. So I think for the second and third missionary journeys, there's good historical foundation. For the first, there's probably something, but a good deal of
patch some stories.
right.
So what about, among the stories patched together, what about the Lystra story about the mistaking our heroes for Paul and Barnabas for being Greek gods?
Right.
Wandering.
So this, I think, is another one of these.
Chapter 14.
Chapter 14. Right. Paul has already preached in Antioch of Pisidia, gives a long sermon there.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back to that and
Yeah,
talk
we
about
will.
some of the themes. But then in chapter 14, he goes first of all to Iconium and then Lystra and Derbe. Where in the world are Lystra and Derbe? This is like going to, I don't know, the backwoods of Kentucky or eastern Arkansas or something. This
Out
is,
of Virginia.
yes, this is not Times Square.
Right, right.
And I think Luke is playing on certain stereotypes about the rustics up country here, as opposed to what he'll be playing on when he has Paul go to Athens in chapter 17.
Yeah.
So I think there's a deliberate parallelism, and in some ways, Luke is trying to show the apostles as reaching all parts of the Roman world, all cultural levels within the Roman world.
Nice.
And where this most emerges is in the reaction to Paul and Barnabas in Lystra, where they are taken by the locals who shout out in the Lycaonian language, according to chapter 14, verse 10. Luke, of course, doesn't tell us what
give us
Lycaonian sounds like. He
Lycaonian
translates
quotes.
into Greek for us, thank you. But the locals think that Paul and Barnabas are Greek gods incarnate, which is, of course, absurd. And I think everybody who was reading this would think that it's absurd and say, what bumpkins would think that? So it's analogous to the Rhoda story that we talked about last time. It's a little bit of comic relief between some various serious things. So
and Luke probably doesn't write for bumpkins.
No.
I mean, our suspicion from the quality of his Greek and the way in which he puts himself in a kind of historical tradition is he's writing for people like his friend Theophilus, who are sufficiently sophisticated to be able to laugh at bumpkins and appreciate philosophers when we get to chapter 17.
Right. They at least have literary pretensions.
They at least have literary pretensions. A well-known phenomenon from that day until now. Okay, talk a little bit about these speeches that Paul gives. What strikes me about them is how freely he interprets the Old Testament, Hebrew Scripture, as if obviously it all refers to Jesus. And when I teach Bible study groups in churches or when I teach seminary classes, we spend a lot of time saying, no, when Isaiah said, behold, a maiden shall conceive, he didn't really have the Mother Mary in mind. And yet Paul just marches right ahead as if every verse in the Old Testament points us straight to Jesus. How do you understand that in terms of Luke's world? And I'd love to know how you understand it in terms of our world.
Right. Well, we see this phenomenon not only in the speech in Acts 13 that you're thinking about, where Paul is portrayed as citing a number of verses to make his point. And we'll go and look at those in a minute or two. But it's been with us all the way through. People are citing scriptures left and right.
Acts 2, right.
And they're doing so in several different ways. Some of it is a simple sort of, if you will, proof texting, or reading the Old Testament with a Christocentric lens. And I think we have to recognize that this was done pretty widely in the early church. Hugely. And some of the examples that are being cited here in Acts 13, we find in other parts of the New Testament. For instance, in Acts 13, verse 33, you are my son, today I have begotten you, from Psalm 2, Psalm 2:7. It was originally a Davidic psalm, and it would have been addressed to the Davidic king.
King on ascension,
who was
enthronement, probably.
Understood to be an adopted son of God. And one of the ways in which early Christians made sense of who Jesus was as a son of David, to whom the royal psalms could have been addressed. So you can understand the logic behind
the kind of
they're reading the psalms,
history of the tradition.
And their assumption that the Word of God is living and active and speaks to us this very day. That was a widespread
Huge.
assumption in the early church.
Yeah.
Now, there are some other versions of this. We find it, let's say, in Matthew's Gospel, where there are prophecies that are fulfilled in our day.
Right.
That sounds an awful lot like what we find at Qumran, the sense that almost every scriptural text is a mirror image or prophecy about the end time.
Yeah.
And there are also, in some ways, some straightforward readings of the Hebrew Bible, and in the sense that they're taken at their literal value, and they're used to construct a story of salvation history. We saw that back in chapter 7 in Stephen's speech.
Stephen does a lot of that.
Yeah. And Stephen's speech, by the way, looks an awful lot like what we get
Hugely.
here in chapter 13.
Yeah.
There's that same sort of salvation historical perspective. So I think we can see a number of things going on here in Luke putting words into Paul's mouth that reflect the kind of discourses that we get throughout early Christianity.
Yeah, and from Paul in his own letters.
That's
Maybe
right.
not exactly the same way, but every bit as much of Old Testament. I want to come back to salvation history, but I want to do it next time because I think it's an important theme. But I want to get us to the last part of chapter 15 here, which is the so-called Jerusalem Council. Many people, it is kind of in the middle of a 28-chapter book. There it is in chapter 15, so that's the middle. But also, I think it's fairly crucial. It's the middle of the story in terms of what happens there. So let's talk a little bit about.
Before you do that, there's one more point I want to make about Scripture back there in 13, because I think it's really interesting.
Go.
One of those scriptural texts that Luke has Paul cite is in Acts 13:47, and it's from Isaiah 49:6, where the divine voice says, "I have set you." This would be the servant of Yahweh, set you to be a light for the Gentiles, so that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. This is never a text that Paul himself cites, but I think it very much expresses what Paul himself thought.
I think
and so
exactly
I think
right.
Luke has this spot on when he has this put on the mouth of Paul.
Yeah, huge. It's Paul's self-picture is that he will go to the ends of the earth because the Gentiles need to get this light.
So Acts 15.
Chapter 15.
You're asking about, right.
Dispute, counsel, decision.
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on Acts 15, but to do so you also have to think about Galatians 2, because we have two reports in the New Testament about what's going on at this so-called Council of Jerusalem. And the time frame is probably the late 40s, 48, 49, somewhere in there. Paul has been engaged in missionary activities for some 14 years, according to his own account in Galatians. And the main issue on the table is, can Gentiles be part of this new Messianic movement without becoming Jews? Or do they need to get circumcised? And interestingly enough, this issue was raised in Galatia, not far from the area where Paul is supposed to have evangelized, according to chapter 13 and 14. So Paul's answer to the question is obviously not. Why? Because you have texts like Isaiah 49:6 saying a light will go to the Gentiles. It doesn't say they have to become Jews. The light will shine on them as Gentiles. That was Paul's position. There's neither Jew nor Greek in this Messianic movement. There were other people who thought this is a movement that's the fulfillment of the promises to Israel. If you're going to be a recipient of those promises, you have to be a member of the people of Israel. If so, you have to be circumcised. That was the basic debate.
And some of that probably associated with James, the brother of Jesus.
James, the brother of Jesus. So it is interesting that in Acts 15, the main spokesperson for what comes to be the apostolic consensus is James, the brother of Jesus, who was the leader of the Jerusalem community. And both he and Peter, it's interesting that Peter does not play the primary role here.
He doesn't.
Peter plays a supporting role, and they agree, they agree that Gentiles do not have to become circumcised. Now, the one little bit of discrepancy between what we hear in Galatians 2 and what we hear in Acts 15 is about the rest of the agreement. And to judge from Galatians 2, the leading apostles, Peter, James, and John in Jerusalem, and Paul and Barnabas, we presume, from Antioch, all agreed that Gentiles could come in without becoming Jews. But they didn't decide what you serve at the potluck when Jews and Gentiles get together after their Eucharistic service or whatever they do. Do you serve ham sandwiches? Or do you serve shrimp cocktail? One answer to that would be yes, and the Jews can avoid it and the Gentiles can eat it. Others would say, no, we ought to be accommodating and everybody ought to eat the same thing. And so whom do you accommodate, the Jews or the Gentiles? Do kashrut laws apply to this community is the critical thing. Paul Obviously, that was not decided in Jerusalem because Peter and Paul argue about it in Antioch.
In Galatians.
According to Galatians.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what we have in Acts is, I think, Luke's reconstruction of what came to be a consensus position in whatever community he was part of.
Yeah.
And in this consensus position, there were certain kinds of food that the mixed community avoids.
Right.
You avoid trafe,
right,
in effect,
yeah.
right? And you also avoid fornication and other such things.
Which seemed like a good plan.
That's right. Right. So Luke has the core of the story right, I think, in terms of history. There are some things that he embellishes and smooths over to a certain extent.
Yeah,
but it is critical on the main point. And here, both Galatians and Acts 15 agree that Gentiles can be part of this movement qua Gentiles.
Yeah, and certainly that's the way the history turns out. This is pure guesswork on my part, do you think that there is that kind of consensus by this time, or do you think that's still being disputed?
When you say by this time,
by the let's say the 40s, when we're in Jerusalem, or do you think that debate goes on in the ongoing Pauline mission?
Oh, it's clear that there's still debate about that, despite the agreement in Jerusalem. Still debate in the areas of Paul's missionary activity about how Jewish someone has to be if you're going to be part of this movement.
By the time we get to the end of the first century, pretty much decided.
Pretty much decided, yeah.
Terrific. Let's just say a word about this business of salvation history, which is a word tossed around a lot when it comes to Luke. And we've talked about how Stephen's sermon picks it up, how Paul's sermon pick it up. What do we mean when we talk about salvation history as a theme in Luke and Acts?
I think this is a way of referring in a shorthanded fashion to the basic storyline of the Old Testament.
Okay.
That is that God established a relationship with a chosen people, and even before that with all of humankind.
Yeah.
And that relationship is one of divine grace that intends for the salvation of eventually all the blessing of all of humankind, as Galatians would say. But it's done so through the instrumentality of a chosen people.
Yeah.
That's, in some ways, a basic plot line of much of the Old Testament. Yeah. And the relationship between God and that chosen people is one that has its ups and downs.
Yeah.
And those ups and downs and those constant attempts to restore a relationship form the subplot lines of the larger story of salvation history. So what we have in Luke is an extension of that story. In some ways, all early Christians buy into and understand themselves as fulfilling that story, although they think the end is going to be very near.
Yes, right.
Luke thinks
not so much.
Not so much, but the story continues.
Yeah, and in a way, the church now takes Israel's place and becomes the mediating and the middle community before the whole world believes again.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Thank you.